This is Andre with a other demo for Mysocket.io. Today we're going to talk about something very exciting, I think. We have introduced authentication support for the sockets, and with that we can now start looking at zero trust like use cases. And that's what we're going to talk about in this blog post and in this demo video. So before we start demoing stuff, I want to talk a little bit about what zero trust is, why it exists, and what use cases it tends to solve. So I find the easiest way to explain what zero trust is to look at the world before zero trust, and that's probably a world that we're all very familiar with, especially given the COVID situation. So a lot of folks today start their day by starting a VPN, connect to the corporate network, and with that you have access to everything in your corporate network. What really happens when you start this VPN is that you become part of the network, and a lot of the corporate networks and cloud infrastructures, we can see them as sort of highly protected castles. So we have tons of firewalls and securities and intrusion detections and stuff like that. And what we do, and that's to make sure that the outside world doesn't get in, in ways that is not intended. And so what we do with VPNs is to essentially poke a little hole in there and say, essentially a giant hole, because once you're authenticated, you're now inside the castle and you have a lot of lateral movement. You're now inside the big walls, and a lot of those security rules don't really apply anymore, right? Because you're now trusted, right? And so this problem becomes even worse for the use cases of contractors, for example, or if you work for a large company, other team members or other people in the company need access to your protected network. And the typical way to solve that is to create a VPN account for that user. So if you think about the use case of a contractor that needs access to your ticket system or your wiki, the first thing you typically do is create a corporate account for that user, an Active Directory account or whatever identity system you're using. And then with that account, because we're all doing a single sign-on, this user can VPN into this giant castle, right? And also now has access to basically a lot of things in the network. Now he's within the castle, and with the same credentials can now access the wiki service, but potentially also can poke around, right? And that is kind of the crutch of why zero trust exists. So even though this is useful, this VPN type setup, it gives you a lot of access, and typically maybe a little bit too much, and it's harder to provide granular access. So Beyond Corp is something that Google coined. This is basically their implementation of a zero trust model. And a lot of what zero trust is hinges around identity-aware proxies. So systems that interact sit between the user and the origins, and do a lot of authentication and authorization and are aware of the context. And so today we're announcing that Mysocket also now has support for identity-aware systems. And so there's 3 additional things that you can enable when you create a Mysocket instance, a socket. So the first thing is you can enable cloud authentication by --cloud auth, either using the CLI or directly using the API. And basically, as soon as you do that and you go to a Mysocket public service, the first thing you'll see is a login screen. And that you've seen similar things like that. We're using OpenID Connect, which is a common standard, and it basically will show you a window that forces you to log in using Google or Facebook or GitHub or whatever. Like there's a few of these things that are provided. Those are the 3 that we support today, as well as creating local accounts, but we can easily add more in the future. So that takes care of the authentication part, but obviously a lot of people have Gmail accounts, and so we don't want to just allow access to anyone with a Google account or a Facebook account. So we also need to do some kind of authorization. And so today we have 2 authorization filter rules. The first one is email domains. So with this, we're saying, hey, if the email address is ending with @mycorp.com, then this user is authorized, right? So maybe that's my company. So all email or all users that authorize with, John@mycorp.com is allowed. And in the case of maybe contractors or other external folks that don't fall under that domain, I would like to say, specific email addresses. So in both cases, you can provide a comma-separated list of domains or email addresses that are allowed. And so that takes care of the authorization. We do intend to add more authorization rules. So for example, geo-based rules, like maybe only allow access if you're located within a certain country, or time of day based rules. So only between 9 to 5 if you're located in, say, Canada or the US. All right, so with that, we basically created an identity-aware socket. We are sure that the user is authenticated, and we are is authorized by making sure it's matching any of these filter rules. And so with that, we've essentially created a VPN replacement because, as you know, the Mysocket.io services, the origin sets up a secure outbound tunnel to the Mysocket.io global infrastructure. So only outbound connections need to be allowed from the origin, which is great. So maybe the wiki server does that and reaches out to the closest Mysocket.io tunnel service and registers itself. That's all encrypted. And then with now the identity-aware socket, we stitch those two together. And in the case of, for example, the contractor use case, the contractor only has access if authorized to that specific wiki. We didn't have to create a corporate account for this user, and we didn't have to give him sort of VPN-wide network access. Okay, so with that, I think we talked a little bit about what Zero Trust is and these identity-aware sockets are. It's time to start doing a demo. And so in this demo, we're going to create this identity-aware socket like this. And I'm going to use a Grafana application, in this case on my laptop, but obviously it can run in your AWS, Google, whatever cloud you're using, or your on-prem corporate data center. We'll modify the Grafana configuration slightly, and you can see the complete, you can follow along here, Grafana configuration, which is pretty standard, but one of the things that we're going to replace is we're going to tell it to trust Mysocket as an authentication and authorization proxy, and we're going to match certain headers, in this case the XAuth email header, to sort of infer the username from that. So in this case, Mysocket will do all the authentication and authorization and pass along several XAuth headers, like the full name, the email, the username, and so on and so forth. And Grafana will use that to make sure that it automatically creates a user. Okay, so enough talking. You can follow along with this GitHub repo. I checked it out here. So the first thing we do is create a socket. So we'll do this like that. So in this case, I'm creating a socket. I'm using the connect statement to do it quickly. This socket is going to forward all traffic that's coming in from the edge to localhost port 3000, which is where we'll start Grafana in a bit. I'm enabling cloud authentication, so make sure that there's this login screen. And I'm saying, actually, all users at mycorp.com or have access, or any of these two. So Andre at tunk.io or John at do.com. So you can see here again that worked, and this is the name that we've been given. So if I just go there real quick right now, we should see a login screen. There you go. I'm not going to log in right now. I'm going to do one more thing here. So the next thing is to modify the grafana.ini file real quickly to make sure that we're using the correct name. So we just need to update. If you're following along at home, just make sure you update the domain name as well as the root URL, and that's just to make sure that Grafana redirects correctly. Okay, so we've done that. So now I'm going to start Grafana, just a local Docker container. I'm also passing it along my AWS credentials, so I can just do a better demo. So there we go. So this is a Docker container just for demo purposes running on my laptop. It sits behind 2 layers of NAT, so no ingress connections are allowed. And there we go. So the Docker container is running. And if I now log in, and I'm going to just for fun log in with an account that that is not authorized. In this case, Andre@tunc.nl, not to confuse with .io, which is the one that we allowed access to. So I'm gonna log in, and this is log in. There we go. And what you see here is that I am authenticated. So the authentication was successful, but the authorization failed, right? Because Andre@tunc.nl is not in this list. Andre@tunc.io is. So what I'm going to do is try this again. And so here you can see the authorization at work. So all this is taken care of on our proxy, identity-aware proxy services. So now I'm going to log in with a Google account, Andre@tunc.io. So Andre@tunc.io. Okay, so I'm being redirected there. I'm going to authenticate with Google. So Google also needs the two-factor authentication, so which I'm doing right now on my phone. Interestingly, the IDP can do two-factor authentication. We can also, in the near future, and we experimented with that, do two-factor authentication, or maybe sort of situational aware two-factor authentication in the socket itself as well. So what you can see now is that that was all successful, and now I am in Grafana that is running on my laptop, but using this public name. I was authenticated and authorized. We can see here that Grafana correctly picked up my identity and created an account. So now let's do something fun real quick, just to make sure it all works. So we're going to add a resource, let's say CloudWatch, because I did pass along my identities. So credential files, and I think we already provided a default region. Let's see if this works. Excellent. So now, see if that works. There we go. And now I can see some of my AWS Grafana performance metrics. All right, so with that, we come to the end of this demo. I think we've seen here how we introduced identity-aware sockets for Mysocket.io. We've looked at how authentication works with OpenID Connect, and in the future, we'll also look at SAML for those who are interested. We've looked at some of the authorization rules that we can add, and we then looked at a demo of a Grafana instance running on a private network behind several layers of NAT, and how we made that available to a contractor with a very specific targeted email address. So I hope you found this interesting and useful. If you're going to work with this, let me know how it works out. If you have any suggestions or questions, do not hesitate to contact me. And I look forward to working more on this with you. Thank you.